You said yes again. You knew before the words were out of your mouth that you did not want to. You felt the familiar sinking, the quick calculation of their disappointment versus your exhaustion, and you chose their disappointment. Again? And now you are sitting with a commitment you resent, wondering why you could not simply say the word that was right there, the word that would have been true. And the reason is not what most people think. The instinct is to call it people-pleasing, to frame it as a personality trait, a nice person, a helpful person, a person who just hates conflict. But the psychology beneath the inability to say no is not about niceness. It is about fear. A very specific, very ancient fear that most people who struggle with this have never fully named. Psychologist Harriet Braiker spent decades studying what she called the disease to please. Her research found that compulsive people-pleasing is almost always rooted in one underlying belief, that being liked, being needed, and being approved of are prerequisites for safety, not comfort. Safety. The person who cannot say no is not making a social calculation. They are responding to a threat that feels as real to their nervous system as any physical danger. The threat of rejection, of disapproval, of being seen as difficult and then abandoned. This is where it gets neurological. Research by Naomi Eisenberger at the University of California, Los Angeles showed that social rejection activates the same regions of the brain as physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex, the part of your brain that registers the sensation of being hurt, lights up when you are excluded or rejected in the same way it lights up when you stub your toe. Your brain does not distinguish well between the pain of a broken bone and the pain of a broken social bond, which means the fear of saying no, the fear of the disapproval that might follow, is not irrational. It is your brain protecting you from something it has categorized as genuinely dangerous. This protection has roots. Psychologist John Bowlby's attachment theory showed that human infants are the most dependent creatures on Earth. A child who is rejected or abandoned by its caregiver does not just feel bad. It faces an existential threat. The nervous system of a young child is wired to read parental approval as survival. And for some people, those who grew up in environments where love was conditional, where approval was unpredictable, where saying no brought withdrawal or punishment, this wiring never fully updated. The adult body grew. The nervous system stayed young. And every time someone asks something of them, the child inside registers a version of the original threat. Psychologist Bessel van der Kolk, whose decades of trauma research produced some of the most important findings about how early experience shapes the adult body, found that people who grew up in conditionally loving environments often develop what he calls fawn responses, a third category of stress response alongside fight and flight. When threat appears, they do not fight and they do not flee. They accommodate, they smile, they help, they say yes, not because they want to, because some part of them learned, very early, that helpfulness was the safest way to remain in proximity to the people they needed most. And here is the twist that most conversations about people-pleasing miss. The person who cannot say no is not always selfless. Beneath the helpfulness is often a complex and unacknowledged transaction. If I say yes, you will like me. If you like me, I am safe. If I am safe, I can stop scanning for the threat. The yes is not a gift. It is a bid for relief. And this is why it rarely produces the relief it is seeking. Because the approval that follows the yes is not unconditional approval. It is approval contingent on continued compliance. And some part of the person who said yes knows this, which is why the resentment builds. Not toward the person who asked, toward the self that could not refuse. The cost of this pattern is significant. Research by psychologist Baumeister on ego depletion showed that every act of self-override, every time you suppress what you actually want in order to comply with what someone else wants, draws on a limited pool of psychological resources. You can say yes against your will a finite number of times before the tank runs empty. And when it does, what remains is not just exhaustion. It is a kind of self-estrangement, a growing distance from your own preferences, your own voice, your own sense of what you actually want from your days. The person who cannot say no eventually stops knowing what they would say if they could. Learning to say no is not a communication skill. That is the wrong frame, and it is why most advice on this subject fails. It is not about finding better words or softer ways to decline. It is about tolerating the discomfort of potential disapproval long enough to discover that it does not destroy you, that the relationship usually survives, that the person usually understands, or if they do not, that their inability to accept your no tells you something important about the relationship. The no itself is not the hard part. The hard part is surviving the moment after, the silence, the possible shift in the other person's face, without immediately walking it back. You said yes again. And somewhere in that yes was a belief you inherited before you were old enough to question it. The belief that your presence in someone's life depends on your usefulness to them. That love is a transaction, and the currency is compliance. And the work, the actual work, is not learning to say no. It is learning to trust that you are worth keeping even when you do.